Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senate Bill 2351 with House amendments was introduced by Senators Wanzik, Miller, and O'Connell, Representatives Hedlund, D. Johnson, and Trottier. Senate Bill 2351 is a bill for an act to create and enact a Section 10-06.1-12.1 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to the ownership or leasing of farm and ranch land for corporations. Mr. Speaker, your Agriculture Committee recommends amendments as follows, and when so amended, recommends do pass on Senate Bill 2351 by a vote of 8 yeas, 4 nays, and 1 absent not voting. Mr. Speaker.
Representative D. Johnson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly. Today, I bring before you Senate Bill 2351, urging you for a vote of yes on a very important piece of legislation. Senate Bill 2351, commonly referred to as the Corporate Farming Bill, would relax the anti-corporate law specifically for the dairy and swine farmers. Historically, North Dakota's anti-corporate farm law was enacted in 1932. Early on in the Depression era, known as the Dirty 30s, farmers started to struggle and to make payments to their lenders for their debts and had lost their ability to support their families with their farms. Corporations began recalling loan debts and taking ownership of the land across North Dakota in order to satisfy these debts. Land ownership went from the family farmers to corporations and lending institutions. Farmland is not available for private ownership. As a result of this, North Dakota voters went to the polls in 1932 and approved a corporate farming bill. This bill was initiated as an initiated measure to protect North Dakota farmers. It did what the voters set out to accomplish. Now, 83 years later, I'm asking this Assembly to consider Senate Bill 2351 to help another group of struggling North Dakota farmers, the dairy and the swine producers. The current anti-corporate law stays intact. What Senate Bill 2351 does do is add a couple of sentences which would allow an exemption for a few friends or neighbors or who would want to get involved to start up a dairy or swine operation. The bill would restrict dairy and swine operations to 640 acres of leased or owned farmland. Although this bill is very similar to current law in South Dakota, the South Dakota law does not have a restriction on the amount of land that can be owned or leased. Minnesota has a restriction of 1,500 acres that can be owned or leased. North Dakota is one of 9 states that has had anti-corporate laws. Of those 9 states, North Dakota is the only remaining state with full restrictions on corporate farming. Legislation similar to that proposed in Senate Bill 2351 has been enacted in the other states and appears to be working. This bill was amended in the House Ag Committee to address the minimum size of the operations. The dairy farm is permitted as an animal feeding operation or as a concentrated animal feeding operation by the State Department of Health. It must consist of at least 50 cows. The swine production facility is permitted as an animal feeding operation or as a concentrated animal feeding operation by the State Department of Health and consists of 500 swine. The farm has 3 years to fully operational from the date of the land is acquired. The Agricultural Commissioner shall by rule develop reporting and monitoring requirements to ensure compliance with this section. From 2002 to 2012, North Dakota has had a 28% decrease in swine production, while 7 of our neighboring states have had a 10 to 54% increase. In the same time frame, North Dakota has had a 41.5% decrease in milk production, while 8 of our neighboring states have had a 7 to 52% increase. South Dakota has permitted for the year 2015 over 24,000 head of additional dairy cows coming into that state. Well, there are only 90 dairy farms in North Dakota, down from 350 just 12 years ago. We have gone from 49,000 dairy cows to 16,000. This has put our dairy processors into a position of having to import milk to meet the demand and keep their operations running to capacity. This is a win-win for agriculture in North Dakota. Because of the restrictions of acreage in this law, it does not represent a threat to the grain farmers and livestock producers in our state. Rather, it produces a value-added industry that is a source of fertilizer to farmers' fields and a market for the grain they grow as feed for the swine and cows. It is the neighbors working together to utilize North Dakota's industry to its maximum potential. The people who want this bill are the dairy farmers, the swine producers, and the farmers who will provide this feed. Senate Bill 2351 comes to you today with a 8-4 committee recommendation for a due pass, and I would ask this assembly to please support your committee with a green vote. Thank you.
Is there any discussion? Representative Onstead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, the bill carrier did a nice job laying out the history of corporate farming in North Dakota. 83-year-old law that served this state really well. And you look at the commodities that we now lead the nation in providing. But is that the solution to make this change for dairy and swine? You know, for years, the dairy industry didn't have a farm bill to provide the support the wheat industry, corn, and soybean had for years. They now have that in place. So we're going to ask this question: are we weakening the corporate farming law, or are we going to strengthen agriculture in the state? Well, if you look at South Dakota, Minnesota were mentioned at that point. They also have processing, they also have favorable weather, and they also have their cost production. It is a business, and you're going to ask an out-of-state corporation to make that investment in that business. And they're going to look at marketing. Not everybody has a chance to be a Class A producer and sell it for grade A milk. And the difference between that and a cheese price is considerable. So it comes back to marketing decision. Well, marketing decision is based on cost of production. North Dakota has a higher cost of production for the dairy industry and the swine industry. We have higher marketing costs. We have lack of processors. If we want to do something in this state, is to bring processors to the state. It's about capital. There's plenty of capital to go around, but we're asking a corporation to make the investment. And so that leads to a couple things. Last session we passed a right to farm law. It appears to me that this is almost an opposite conclusion of that as we move forward. What if somebody's denied the law to expand and they're denied the permitting because of zoning or county zoning laws? Okay, is that in direct conflict with the right to farm? I believe it is. The other part is we also soundly defeated measure number 5 last session. And I think the obsession with that was we didn't want nonprofits to take ownership. Okay, I find there's not a whole lot of difference from an out-of-state corporation and a nonprofit to come in and get in this purchasing of property. And so, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, although I've been very supportive of the dairy industry and the changes, but I'm also supportive of the current law that is in place. And I will say that these changes, are they going to help it? I think it opens up a loophole. I think it weakens that portion of that. And if anything we can do is really support the processors to come back to North Dakota, but it is a marketing decision to make that investment. And whether they will come in and things turn south, are they going to quick pull out at that point? So it raises a lot of questions for everybody. Are we strengthening this or are we weakening this? Are we better for that industry? So, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that we would not support this the way it's currently being written. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative M. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Johnson will yield to question.
Mr. Speaker, I will.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When permitting animal operations, there's confined animal feeding operations and there's animal feeding operations. And then there's also general permits or findings of no potential to pollute. Could a corporation operate under either a general permit or if the State Health Department found once they did apply that there was no potential to pollute?
Representative Johnson.
Well, Mr. Speaker and Representative Nelson, I think this is why we put the amendments in there, to have an A4 or K4 designation on what the operation could be and leave it up to the Ag Department to work with the State Health Department to make this determination.
Thank you. May I continue?
You may continue.
Well, a general permit is neither a KFO or an AFO permit, but functions as an AFO permit. And in a case of a finding of no potential to pollute, which is the most favorable determination, there's no permit given. The operation does not have to keep coming in every 5 years and re-permitting. So it seems a little strange that if an operation has a really good plan, so it's found to have no potential to pollute, it doesn't get a permit. I guess, would the bill carrier yield to another question, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Johnson will yield to question.
Yes, I will, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Johnson, when we do the environmental laws, they're based on animal units. And 75 head of dairy cows is, or 50 head of dairy cows is 75 or 67 units. And 200 head of swine are either 200 units or 50 units, depending on their size. Since we're using the environmental laws as the gatekeeper, was a discussion of equalizing the animal units so that they would represent an equivalent environmental risk?
Representative Johnson.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Nelson, this bill came from the Senate with no restrictions, and the argument was what would prevent one potbelly pig from being considered a swine operation. And so the numbers we put in there were just minimum numbers to address the concerns that came over from the Senate. And honestly, the economy of scale, I don't think we're going to be looking at small operations. My thoughts on this is going to probably be a 5,000 hog operation at least. And the dairies, we dropped that down to 50 because a lot of your smaller dairies are still 80 numbers, but the economy of scale is, I would believe you'd be looking at 500-600 head dairies.
Okay, thank you, Representative Johnson. I don't have any further questions. Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
You may continue.
Well, members of the House, here's the type of problems we're creating. We're using environmental laws that are based on the hazard to the environment and to the public as the gatekeeper for ownership of an operation. And then we're not even really making them equivalent. For instance, the bill says 500 swine, but under the environmental law, 500 swine over 55 pounds is 200 animal units. 500 swine under 55 pounds is 50 animal units. So a 500 swine where it's weanlings, that's a really small operation. Now the reason that causes a great problem is now we're attempting to treat one person under the law differently than another person. And I would put to you that if we're going to require a permit on a corporation at 50 animal units, that we effectively are forcing the health department to require a permit on on all feeding operations at 50 animal units. Otherwise, we have a very unjustifiable and unfair law. And this creates a whole series of problems for a lot of our small producers across this state, people who have not been required to get permits. Now they're going to be required to get permits because we're using this environmental law as the gatekeeper. This is, imagine if we did it with oil wells. If an oil well is owned by a corporation, it has to follow all these laws of the state, but if it's owned by a private individual, it doesn't have to follow the environmental laws. How long do you think that would stand up? If we want this law to stand up, we have to treat everyone the same. And from the face of it, this bill is attempting not to treat everyone the same. And I really think we're forcing the health department, in order to treat everyone the same, to go to very great environmental restrictions on our livestock producers that we don't want them to live under, the health department doesn't want them to live under, and they certainly don't want to live under. So I'd ask that you give this a red vote. Thank you.
Representative Hedlund.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. Let's get to what we're really talking about here. Today, we already allow corporations to farm. I happen to be one of them. There just happens to be some restrictions in that corporate structure which only allows family members to be part of it. So what are we talking about? We're going to make a change to allow non-family members be a part of a corporate structure that we currently allow in farming today. You know, the opposition to this bill, they've talked a lot about out-of-state corporations coming in and buying up land. Do we really believe that an out-of-state corporation such as Walmart wants to come in and just own farmland for the sake of owning it? I just think the arguments are somewhat disingenuous. But I understand why they're being put forward, Mr. Speaker, because it's really hard to imagine how we don't have a structure today with our anti-corporate law that essentially is going to, in the end, do the same thing that the anti-corporate law was first meant to do, to protect us from. And that is allowing huge families to generally gather up all the land. They'll own it themselves, because how is a young person in today's world, with the profit that is provided for most commodities, going to compete with his neighbor who has acquired thousands and thousands of acres? You know, I'm not worried about competing against those, and I don't think, you know, there's anything that we really should do to stop that. What we're talking about here is allowing investment from other people that just don't happen to be related. I think this is a bill that needs to pass. I think it's long overdue. And Mr. Speaker, frankly, I think it should be expanded to other areas of agriculture. But I don't want to muddy up that water today. So I just ask that we pass this bill and move it on to the Senate and get a signature from the governor.
Representative Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative D. Johnson, yield to question.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will.
Representative Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Johnson, I'm in favor of the bill philosophically and in principle, but I'm just curious about the concerns with the CAFO and the AFO, and I'm wondering, is there a potential, well, I guess my question is, can you be permitted as an animal feeding operation if there's a finding of no pollution by the Department of Health? And if you can't receive that permit under such a scenario, how would you go about enjoying the benefits that we're looking to put into the code here? That would be under a general instead of an AFO.
Mr. Speaker and Representative Olson, you know, and that's partly why we pulled the bill back to committee Friday is to address the size of the operation with the AFO and animal feeding operation. And this is up to your township zoning, if there is such a group, or it goes on to the county zoning if there is such a group. If not, then it goes all the way up to the state health department to make this determination. And so with an AFO, you can go from one head all the way up to reach the different levels of CAFOs, and so I don't see where that determination would be up to the state health departments if they're going to depend on streams, location, and if there isn't in that area, they're going to have to determine which area that would be in that community. They have their meetings with the local folks, you know, as public input before they come into those areas to permit them, and there's a lot that goes into. You just don't put a group into a community. You have to have your meetings with the folks that are going to agree to come into that community and look at the environmental issues as far as coming in there also.
Representative Kepenik.
Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, I've been through this permitting process on feedlot. Basically, it consists of, if you're over 1,000 head, is where you need to start applying for these confined feeding operation permits. Anything under it is pretty much up to your local boards, but it's NRCS that really, it's federal is where these confined feeding operations and where you start having to deal with the permits. The reason is that health department's in it because they're the arm of the EPA. I think that the way this bill reads, it's either or. It gives you a minimum, and then if you go over, if you read the two lines, it's an either or on it. I don't think the permitting on this, like I said, if you're over 1,000 head, it's an automatic. You got to go through the permitting process. If you're under, you can go through the process, but it's not a requirement that way. But I just wanted to straighten that out. Thank you.
Representative D. Johnson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I don't believe in my testimony I talked about out-of-state corporations. This gives anyone in-state the opportunity. It can be a group of neighbors that can go together with an investment like this. I don't believe we're talking about the large evil corporations as we're referring to them as here. The other thing, and that wasn't my testimony, but I can't stress enough, of the 50 states, 41 states have never had anti-corporate farming laws. Only 9 states have dealt with corporate farming laws. And we are the last state looking at relaxing laws with 2 industries that are really hurting in the state. And we can do nothing and watch them fade away. But I think we have an opportunity here to try and help them, and I think it's responsible for us to try and help this industry survive along with the processors. My goodness, we're importing milk from out of state, and it may be corporate milk we're importing, but that's the milk that's coming in there to keep these processors running into capacity. And think of all the jobs that are involved with these organizations too. If we lose a processor, Emmons and Morton County are our 2 largest dairy counties in North Dakota. And this Bismarck processor depends on those folks, and if that processor goes, then where do we go? So I would just please support this bill.
Is there further discussion? The House has before it for final consideration Senate Bill 2351. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Do any members wish to change their vote? The key will be closed and the clerk will take the record. The final vote shows 56 yea, 37 nay, 1 absent and not voting. House Bill 2351 is declared passed.